Hello and welcome to the ICA's Diversity and Inclusion Series, Celebration of People, where we are aiming to spotlight the compliance industry's leading diversity champions that are making a difference in the industry and in society at large. Today, I'm joined by Paul, a compliance professional with over 20 years experience in the field and a fellow member of the ICA. Paul, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me today. Looking forward to the discussion.
So the topic of our discussion today focuses mainly on recognising some of the challenges that we face within the compliance world when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So I guess the most natural place to start would be to ask what you think those main challenges are.
Well, I think there's industry-wide challenges, but also societal challenges. And I think that the discussion about diversity and inclusion has been a discussion that's been in place for some time, but clearly has accelerated over the past 2 or 3 years, and perhaps most significantly this year. I think the challenges that, whether it's race, sexuality or gender, these can be quite taboo subjects. So I think organisations have found it difficult entering into these discussions for fear of getting things wrong. And similarly, individuals from a diverse background have felt a difficulty raising their views and raising their concerns and raising their perspectives. I think what has changed this year, especially with sort of the Black Lives Matter movement, is that people do now feel empowered to raise their genuine concerns and to be their authentic self. And I think that transparency has caused a greater discussion about race and diversity. And many organisations are now putting in initiatives. They're trying to remove barriers. They're trying to understand how they can help their people more. And I think compliance is no different from that. I think the benefit of compliance is that it's a relatively new profession. So unlike perhaps a legal profession, which has arguably systemic and historic issues, compliance is relatively new, with individuals who have entered the industry over the past sort of 10, 20 years. So I do think compliance has a massive opportunity to be a leading pioneer of inclusivity and diversity.
Yeah.
But I guess the challenge now is what do we do with this new information? How do we evolve the industry here on in?
Absolutely, and it's interesting that you mentioned sort of the most recent events, the more recent sort of media coverage when it comes to diversity and inclusion worldwide. Do you think that there's been an impact on diversity and inclusion through the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic? Do you think that there's been a correlation there in the compliance world?
I think there's been a correlation in the sense that for the past 6 months, we've all been stuck at home. And I think organisations and the industry has had to embrace diversity in a way it's never done before, because people are at home, whether it's mental health, whether it's people having to deal with their families at home. And the fact that we are all at home confronted with news stories all the time, so we've embraced it and learn more about it than ever before. And I think that every business has had to think about their diversity and inclusion agenda, make sure they are as inclusive as possible to deal with individuals who are facing this pandemic in very different ways. And I definitely think that accelerated the discussion about diversity and inclusion. And whilst 2020 has been a really, really tough year, I think the benefit is that we've had the opportunity to have richer conversations, to put in place plans, so when we enter 2021, I think we'll be more empowered as an industry and as corporations to address some of these issues in a far more effective way.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's interesting you mentioned there sort of at a corporation level and an individual level. I guess another question and one that kind of repeatedly flagged up in the survey that we launched to our community a few weeks ago is, in your sort of opinion, in your experience, whose responsibility is diversity and inclusion? Where does that sit within a business? Is it at an individual level? Should that kind of be brought from the top down? What's your thoughts on?
I think it's a really, really interesting question. And I don't think there's a perfect answer. But from my own perspective, I'm 44. And I personally didn't really discuss diversity and inclusion until recently. You know, I've got 2 young kids, perhaps made me think about things a bit more. I, like everyone else, have seen the horrific things that have happened this year. And I think on the back of that, I've become more interested. But I've never in my career prioritize my race. It's never been that relevant to me, other than my pursuit to be the best I can be in my job. And I wanted to be a black director, and a director who happens to be black. And so I never, therefore, felt comfortable talking about race at work, because I didn't want that to define me.
Yeah.
I've certainly been on my own personal journey, and I think it's down to other people to go on their own journeys as well, and people have their own experiences. So I don't think it's fair to pinpoint exactly who should be accountable for this. But from my perspective, having immersed myself in diversity and inclusion quite a lot more recently, my perspective is that it can't necessarily be owned by one person.
No.
I think we all have a part to play in this discussion, regardless of our race, our sexuality, or ethnicity. We all have a part to play. And from my experience at work, the more we make the conversation about diversity and inclusion as inclusive as possible, and get as many people to contribute as possible, that's when we have the richer discussion.
Yeah.
And where I work, we have tried to accelerate the discussion by having networks. We have a BAME network. We have a network focuses on gender, network focuses on sexuality, and that has been a good way to accelerate the discussion. But over time, I like to think that rather than these three networks being accountable for these important areas, it becomes a discussion across the whole business.
Of course. No, absolutely. And I think it's really powerful there that you mentioned sort of through your own experiences, it's perhaps not a conversation you'd had at all up until recently, particularly when you mentioned sort of having children and things like that, maybe that being a catalyst for the discussion. But I think one really powerful piece that came from our survey was people kind of pinpointing, well, we think it should be senior management that handle this, so this should be something that the board looks at, instead of actually looking at us as individuals and in much smaller groups of society, and recognise that it's a responsibility that we all should share. So it's really powerful to sort of hear your views on that as well.
Yeah, I think that to accelerate things, it's great to have the networks. And clearly, it's great to have board endorsement, and it's delivering that tone from the top. And I think that people tend to replicate the communications and the culture that's emanated from the board to get that tone from the top. So that's critical. But I think the point is that it can't just be the CEO and the board interested in this stuff, because then it becomes a transactional exercise whereby the board says do something, people do it. I think in order to get real inclusivity, it's important for everyone to be included in the discussion. And I do think it's a really interesting question, as I said, because I think that the challenges that people may look at me as a black male and think I've got all the answers in terms of ethnicity, and I can speak on behalf of the black community. I absolutely cannot, and I'm one person who have had my own experiences, and that's why there's such a danger of assuming that because someone's black or from a diverse background, they have all the answers. Similarly, if someone's Caucasian, they don't have the answers, they can't contribute. And what I've tried to do within my diversity inclusion initiatives at work is made sure that we have a genuinely inclusive discussion and make sure we have as many allies as possible as part of that discussion. And only yesterday we had a lunch and learn we have at work whereby an individual talks about their experiences. And yesterday we had a working class male talking about his experiences. And for me, that was really important to have that white working class male share his perspective and make sure he's part of the discussion. It was really key for those from less diverse backgrounds, really keen for them not to feel alienated from the discussion. And that's why it's such a big challenge. It can't be solved by one person, but the more inclusive discussions we have, and discussions like this are really important, but the more inclusive they are, I think the better it will be in terms of accelerating inclusivity across both society and the compliance profession.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're both in agreement that starting these kind of conversations is one of the biggest drivers in sort of pushing that forward, but industry and society levels. I guess a part of what we're trying to do here at the ICA, this isn't about us having all the answers, as you alluded to before. We don't have all the answers here, but what we're trying to do is create at least a safe space for people to talk about this within our sort of world. As well as that sort of inclusion of different levels of society, like you just said about your sort of, what do you think is important to create that safe learning, that safe, even if it's just a safe learning space, a safe place to talk? What do you think sort of needs to come into that?
I think it's what I found over the past year in particular is the importance of listening. And I think that we all have very unique experiences, and experiences can be based on gender, ethnicity, sexuality, class, where you've been brought up. So everyone has these unique experiences. And I think it's such almost a tragedy when one makes an assumption that, look at me, just because I'm a 6'2" a black male, I've had certain experiences. There's certainly people at work who've expressed to me their experiences of being black in the UK are completely different from mine. That doesn't make my experiences any less valid. It just means my experience is different from theirs. And I think it's so important to listen and learn from others. And I think the more you listen and learn and try not to judge, and the more people feel empowered to share their experiences, and then you almost just create that safe environment whereby be authentically you, share your story, we will listen, and we will learn from it. We may not always agree, we may not always be able to deliver the answers, but by creating that safe space, you do get that honest discussion. And for the first time in my lifetime this year, people have had those honest articulation of their experiences, and sometimes the experiences are quite tough to hear. You think, wow, I never even thought of that, or I never even experienced that myself, or never even assumed that could even happen. But by having that open discussion, you do get that sense of inclusivity. And certainly where I work, on the basis of what we've heard from individuals, we've tried to change things, whether that's the nature of our interview panels. We've introduced mentoring, we've introduced reverse mentoring, we've introduced lunch and learn sessions once a week. And it's created a really safe and inclusive environment. And on the back of that, people have certainly felt empowered to share their stories. But I certainly think that those individuals who perhaps hadn't been authentically themselves in the past have been far more empowered. And I'm pleased to say, over the past 18 months, there's been a number of people who've gone on to bigger and better things within the organisation because they have the confidence now to really be themselves. And I think that's the importance of diversity and inclusion. Yeah, and that's brilliant to see that you're, as a business, overcoming these challenges that we're talking about today, and seeing the benefits of overcoming those challenges and how it affects you as an organisation, but also for those individuals as well who perhaps never would have taken that step had these conversations not have happened. And I guess the final question for me, and we've been doing it throughout this entire conversation, is around the way that diversity and inclusion are so often grouped together. Do you think that they automatically go hand in hand? Do you think one should come before the other? I mean, it's said that representation is a measure of diversity and the employee experience is a measure of inclusion. So I guess it's interesting just to hear your point of view on if they do sit together, if they should be tackled separately. Well, diversity and inclusion. I think there's we're trying to confront a challenge by grouping things together because it's easier to do. And before I answer the question about D&I, I just want to make a comment about BAME as well, because I think it's similar. Okay. And my comment there is that in order to tackle how we support those from an ethnic minority background, we've classed them as BAME as a generic term. I loathe the term, because what it does is groups a whole bunch of people under one term. And any person of colour would say that the Asian experience is very different from the West African experience, very different from East African experience, very different from Caribbean experience. And there's a real difficulty of bunching things all together. And similarly with diversity and inclusion, they're two quite different things, aren't they? One's about having a diverse workforce, which is representative of different communities, different classes, etc. Inclusion is about what do you do when people are together, and how do you get the maximum out of individuals once all together in an inclusive environment. So all those terms are quite generic, but they are trying to tackle very different issues. And getting back to your question about diversity and inclusion, I think that ideally I would separate them and tackle the two things differently. But I think that putting them together has been an effective way in the short term of trying to address some of these issues. but over time, perhaps we'll be a bit more
Yeah.
sophisticated in our analysis and be able to break down the two a little bit more. And certainly hope over time as well, the term BAME becomes no longer relevant, because we understand the challenges different communities face.
Nice.
And I think those challenges are lost when you group them all together in one term.
No, that's super interesting. As I said, perhaps something that a lot of people have perhaps just become accustomed to referencing when we talk about these kinds of things. So that really is fascinating to hear. And honestly, Paul, this has been brilliant. This has been inspiring, eye-opening to say the least. And I've really enjoyed having a chat with you today. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.